So tell me.
You don't want to do this, Roy. It's the game. It's the adrenaline rush.
An elderly man creates a profile on a dating website and indicates that he is a widower. He also indicated that he doesn't smoke or drink, which is a lie. An elderly woman also creates a profile on the same site. She is tired of loneliness and seeking a life companion. They start corresponding and soon agree to have dinner together. The events take place in London in 2009. The elderly man, who introduced himself as Brian, met the elderly woman, who introduced herself as Estelle, in a restaurant. She told about her grandson Stephen. He is all Estelle has left. Her husband passed away a year ago. Brian allegedly has a son. He didn't hide that he had repeatedly met different women from the dating site, but always faced disappointments. According to Brian, the thing he condemns the most in people is dishonesty. That's why he decided to confess that his real name is not Brian but Roy Courtney. Turns out the woman was lying too. Her real name is Betty McLeish. The date went well. Betty's grandson, Stephen, came to pick her up. Betty offered Roy a ride home, but he declined, saying that his home was just a few minutes away by train. In reality, Roy left in a taxi. On the same evening, Roy went to a nightclub, where he met in the VIP lounge with his associates lounge, engaged in illegal activities. Roy told them that some people, Russians, had offered him a promising investment venture. Seeing a message from Betty, Roy understood that she had fallen for his deception. Their next date took place at the cinema. Later, as they walked down the street, Roy suddenly began limping, claiming knee problems. Soon he met with his associates again. The goal of their joint investment was to purchase property in the Caribbean. Once the deal was finalized, the property would be sold for double the price. All transactions were conducted electronically through a special console. As per the agreement, the double amount would be transferred back within a week. When Bryn made an inappropriate joke, the Russian partners left, refusing to participate in the venture. Roy ordered Bryn to regain their trust at any cost. On the next date with Betty, Roy pretended to limp again. Coincidentally, Betty had just bought a car today. Now Roy was certain that the widow had money. Feeling pity for the lame gentleman, Betty brought him to her home. The plot was sufficiently large, and the house was simply but tastefully furnished. It was evident that Betty had savings. They chatted for several hours, joked and laughed, but dinner was interrupted by Stephen, Betty's grandson, who didn't live here but visited his grandmother occasionally. Betty said that Stephen was a historian and was writing his doctorate. The guy was immediately wary of the grandmother's new suitor and hinted that it was time for Roy to go home. Betty asked her grandson to give Roy a ride. She went with them. Learning that Roy lived on the top floor and there was no elevator in the building, Betty kindly offered him to stay at her place until his leg got better. Of course, Stephen was against it, but Roy was in no hurry to accept the offer either. However, seeing how Roy was suffering because of his sore leg, Betty couldn't stay away and brought him to her home. Stephen, who was still against it, helped Roy move his things because that's what Betty wanted. The next morning, Roy enjoyed hot coffee and a cigarette. In this neighborhood, mainly retirees reside. However, Roy noticed a suspicious guy in a silver car who seemed to be spying on him. Upon returning to the house, Roy overheard Stephen cautioning his grandmother about her new suitor. In Stephen's opinion, too little time has passed for them to become so close. But Betty doesn't share these concerns. Roy joined them for breakfast. It was a surprise to learn that Betty used to teach at Oxford. She had never mentioned it before. Listening to Roy, Stephen realized that the old man was spouting one cliché after another. Nevertheless, at his grandmother's request, Stephen agreed to drive Roy wherever he needed to go. Roy said he was planning to visit a friend with cancer. Of course, that was a lie. Donning his business suit, Roy went to the office. Bryn not only managed to get the Russian partners back, but also persuaded everyone to double their shares. All the money was transferred into a common fund. Everyone was immensely satisfied with the successfully executed deal. However, when Vlad, one of the Russian partners, hugged Bryn, it became clear that Vlad had been bugged all this time. The police arrived immediately. Everyone started running, except Vincent, the Russians and Roy, who feigned a heart attack. It turned out to be a ruse. There was no police, nor any property in the Caribbean, Roy and Vincent had conspired with the Russian partners to misappropriate all the money. They raised a toast to the successful scam. Stephen picked up Roy from the same place, the hospice. Stephen also stayed for dinner at his grandmother's. The guy plans to leave and visit historically significant places, believing that the past becomes more tangible there. This will aid him in writing his dissertation. When Stephen asked Roy if he served in the army and where he got his scar, Roy said he didn't want to discuss it. Stephen left, and Roy again noticed the suspicious guy in the silver car. The next day, Roy met with Vincent. Their runaway investment group is convinced that all the funds are frozen, and the police are searching for them. Everything went according to plan. Roy and Vincent came to see Vlad, who works as a cook at the restaurant. He stated that he didn't just want a fee for his involvement in the affair but a share. Vlad also hinted to Roy that he knew all about his past. However, Roy turned out to be a far more dangerous person than anyone could have imagined. For his greed and audacity, Vlad was punished. Now Roy intends to take advantage of Stephen's absence to deceive Betty and misappropriate all her money. He introduced Vincent to Betty as his accountant, handling the will. When Roy told Betty that he wanted to leave her something, she was surprised and touched. At the same time, Betty advised him to think about his son, Robert, but Roy claimed he disapproved of his lifestyle. Vincent began enumerating all the risks associated with money. Many retirees, who had saved all their lives, lose everything by carelessness. When Betty mentioned that the sum of her savings was almost $3 million, Vincent and Roy were speechless. Vincent told her about his fund, through which her money would double in 5 years. Also, Betty and Roy could combine their assets to reduce taxes. However, Betty didn't rush to make a decision but promised to think about it. On the same evening, Roy went into Betty's room and confessed his feelings to her. But Betty said she wasn't ready for anything more yet because she was still grieving for her late husband. To earn Betty's trust, Roy even used the word love. However, it still didn't convince her. At night, when Betty went to the kitchen for a drink of water, she noticed someone near the house and called out to Roy. Taking a flashlight, he went outside and saw a broken flower pot. The next day, Roy told Vincent about the incident. Maybe someone is following them. Later, Vincent and Roy met with Betty again, who was amazed to learn that Roy's investments had supposedly doubled. Stephen arrived, and seeing this, immediately suspected foul play, calling Roy a fraud. However, Betty unconditionally believed Roy and asked her grandson not to interfere. Of course, Stephen wasn't going to give up so easily. Betty apologized to Vincent, and he was forced to leave. Roy explained to Stephen that he only wished the best for Betty. It seemed the guy calmed down a bit. In the evening, Roy and Betty had dinner at a restaurant. Roy said he wanted to give half of his money to Stephen, and they could spend the other half on a joint trip. Betty and Roy are becoming closer. One day Betty, who decided to cut Roy's hair herself, felt unwell and asked him to call her family doctor. It turns out Betty regularly experiences mini strokes, but she doesn't follow the doctor's recommendations. Now Betty needs complete rest, but she doesn't want to spend the rest of her life like this. Roy told Betty that he would do anything for her. They are getting ready for the trip that Betty had been looking forward to. She had planned to go there with her husband, but unfortunately she didn't make it in time. One day Bryn saw Roy walking with Betty on the street. Roy also noticed him. Panicking, Roy suggested that Betty pick out new shoes and meet in an hour. When she left, Roy headed towards the metro, hoping to get away. Bryn followed him. Of course, he had already guessed the fraud. It was Bryn who smashed the flower pot at night. He threatened Roy with telling Betty if he didn't pay him back the $100,000. Certainly, Roy wasn't going to give in. Seeing an approaching train, Roy pushed Bryn. After that, he hurriedly left the scene of the incident and changed his clothes. Meeting Betty, Roy suggested they go to Europe tomorrow. Betty gladly agreed. They arrived in Berlin. Stephen was already here. For Roy, it was an unpleasant surprise, as the presence of Betty's grandson could complicate everything. Stephen gave them a tour of the city's landmarks. When Stephen said something in German, Roy seemed to understand. However, he pretended not to know German. Roy was tired and wanted to return to the hotel. Betty was going for a walk alone. Few know that this city reminds her of the past. Later, Betty returned to the hotel in tears. When Roy asked what happened, she said she hurt her hand. Before dinner at the restaurant, Stephen decided to surprise them and took them somewhere. Entering the building, Roy immediately recognized the place. Stephen said the owner allowed them to use the apartment. When they entered the apartment, Stephen asked Roy if he remembered this place. It turns out Stephen checked Roy's military card and learned that he was wounded at this address. This was 3 years after the war. Roy told the truth. That was when he first arrived in Berlin accompanied by his translator, Hans Taub. Roy was here to arrest a former Nazi named Gager. They disguised themselves as civilians so that they would not be identified. Gager lived with his friend precisely at this address. However, everything went awry because Roy and Hans mistook Gager for his friend. Gager grabbed Roy and ordered Hans to drop his gun. A struggle ensued, and in the end Gager fired. Roy was injured, Hans passed away, and Gager escaped. Stephen already knows the truth. When Gager was captured by Soviet soldiers, he revealed that it was Hans Taub, the translator, who survived. Roy had to admit that he had appropriated someone else's identity. He is Hans Taub who survived. In the past, people around had often remarked on their resemblance. It was easy for Hans to pretend to be an Englishman because he had taught English since he was 14. All Hans wanted was to leave Germany, which had brought him so much misfortune. This allowed him to start a new life. First, Hans wrote to Roy Courtney's family that his service in Germany irreversibly changed him, and he wanted to sever ties with all relatives. Stephen finds it unfair. Even if Hans wasn't a Nazi and wasn't involved in any war crimes, the real Roy Courtney's family has the right to know the truth. Betty stood up for Roy, asking her grandson to leave immediately. Stephen is right about one thing: she doesn't really know Roy, but he is the only person with whom she doesn't feel lonely. The couple decided not to continue their European journey and returned home. Upon arrival, Betty announced to Roy that she is ready to open a joint account with him. Roy immediately met with Vincent and told him about their success. Vincent thinks it would be wrong to leave Betty completely without means of livelihood, since she is ill. But Roy disagrees. He intends to take everything. However, from his tone, Vincent guessed that he doesn't want to do that. Has Roy really fallen in love with Betty? Even if it's true, he will never admit it. The day came when Roy and Betty met with the pseudo-accountant. Vincent provided them with documents to sign for the opening of a joint fund and gave them consoles for transferring money to the shared account. But at the last moment Betty hesitated, unsure if it's worth risking all the money given her frail health. To gain Betty's trust, Roy showed that he was ready to transfer all his money. This made Betty put aside her doubts and also transfer the money. It seems the naive elderly woman doesn't even suspect that she has just become a victim of scammers. Roy received a call but ignored it. When Vincent left, Betty opened a bottle of champagne to celebrate their joint investments. She also asked Roy who had called. Roy claimed it was supposedly his son Robert, with whom he had a complicated relationship. They were supposed to meet today. As always, Roy lied about going by train. Of course, Roy didn't tell Betty that he was going to leave for good. Discreetly, he packed his things. Roy didn't want to admit to himself that he had become attached to Betty during this time. She offered to walk him to the bus stop. Roy hesitated, but Betty insisted he should meet his son and talk. Roy glanced at Betty one last time. She watched the train pull away. That night Roy got drunk. It was perhaps the most challenging scam of his life. Realizing the console was missing, Roy left Vincent a voicemail asking him to come over right away. Roy had no choice but to return to Betty's house. The lights in all the rooms were off. Roy called out to Betty, but she didn't answer. Besides, the house looked like it had just been moved out. Finally, Roy found Betty in one of the rooms. In her hands was the console. She made it clear she knew he had come back for it. She also knows he doesn't have any son. At that moment Roy, whose real name was Hans Taub, horrifyingly realized who was really in front of him. Many years ago, in 1943, he had been an English tutor for a girl named Lily. She was from a wealthy German family. On that day Lily wasn't ready. 15-year-old Hans was bored of waiting and watched her sisters dancing. The girls immediately involved the young handsome guy in their dance, flirting with him. But when Hans became too persistent, one of the girls pushed him away. Angry Hans left the room. Lily was ready for the English lesson. She was in love with Hans and wore a silver pendant with a strand of his hair, but he had something else in mind. Knowing no one would see or hear them, Hans did a bad thing to Lily. That was his revenge against her sisters for humiliating him. When Lily's mother entered, she immediately sensed something was wrong and ordered Hans to follow her. The entire family gathered downstairs. Hans denied everything. Lily couldn't say a word and ran away in tears. The head of the family, a German industrialist, told Hans to get out. 2 days later, Lily's father was arrested. Someone denounced him, accusing of treason. The factory's assets and money were confiscated. The father was sentenced to capital punishment, and Lily's mother could not bear it and voluntarily passed away. During the war, Lily lost all 3 of her sisters. Of course, Lily knows that it was Hans who wrote the denunciation against her father. All these years, Lily planned her revenge. Stephen assisted her in every way. Together they managed to find out that Hans became a swindler who cheats elderly women and more. On that day in Berlin when Lily hurt her hand, she returned to her family's house, now housing the children's fund, and found her silver pendant with a strand of Hans's hair. She already had a sample of Roy's hair. That's how she was able to link him to Hans' tap. Lily, now Betty, had already withdrawn all her money from their joint account with Vincent's help. Stephen spoke with him before their trip to Berlin. Vincent was afraid of going to jail for fraud, so he agreed to assist. By the way, Betty has many grandchildren, but Stephen is not one of them. However, Michael, the guy in the silver Audi, is one of them. All the grandchildren helped Betty act out this play. The doctor, by the way, was also a fake. In reality, Betty has no health problems. Betty had been waiting for the day of revenge for 60 years. Roy knelt, begging for her forgiveness. But Betty didn't need his apologies. Before leaving, she left him some money and intended to go to her real home. However, Roy couldn't let her go so easily. Stealthily taking Betty's phone, he blocked her path. A struggle ensued between them. Vlad and his partner, whom Roy had deceived earlier, came to Betty's aid. They came for their money. Betty left Roy exactly what he owed those guys. But greed wouldn't allow Roy to part with the money so easily. As Betty left, she heard screams. After some time, Vincent visited Roy, who had suffered a stroke, in the nursing home. The nurse pitied Roy, saying it was an unjust fate for someone who had been through a war. Meanwhile, Betty and Stephen celebrated their victory. They are close friends. At Betty's house, all the closest people are gathered for a party. Family is the most important thing to her.